Welcome to Hub Dialogues. I'm your host, Sean Speer, editor-at-large at The Hub. I'm honored to be back in conversation with award-winning journalist and best-selling author Amanda Lang for another installment of our bi-weekly video and podcast series on the key issues concerning Canadian business, economics, and public policy. In today's conversation, we'll aim to cover two topics. First, this week's federal cabinet shuffle and what it might tell us about the direction of economic policy and the issues that may animate the next election whenever it comes. And second, new demands from industry groups that Ottawa grant small and medium-sized businesses an extension on the repayment of loans provided during the pandemic and whether the government ought to comply. Amanda, we have a busy show. Thanks as always for joining us.
Great to be with you.
Let's start with the cabinet shuffle. The government positioned the significant changes to its cabinet, as many as 30 moves, as a refocus on the economy. Yet a lot of key economic ministers, most notably Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland, didn't move. Mm-hmm. What do you think is behind such a big shuffle? And do you think it signals anything about the government's policy direction?
I would make two observations. And one is that we can maybe read less into these kinds of shuffles than we might have in the past. We could talk a little bit more about that. I do think that leaving some of those core economic ministers, especially Chrystia Freeland, I think a move of Freeland that would be the only subject across the land today, what that signified and what it suggested about her tenure or what was happening next. Some of the ministers, as people will be aware, have been in problematic files or files that have had problems and have been on the hot seat. So to remove them maybe looks like, I don't know, does it look like punishment for that minister, mismanagement? Does it just look like they want to change the storyline a little? I will tell you one thing I was interested in. I was doing a bit of research because it does seem to me that cabinets only get bigger. Yes. And you wonder, do we need this many? Pierre Elliott Trudeau shuffled his cabinet in 1972 after losing, of course, and his government coming back as a minority. And it was a shuffle to a 30-person cabinet. So actually, it was pretty big even in 1972. The cost of living was the major issue of that day. And 8 ministers were out. And there were 18 changes to that cabinet. So I must say it does happen. Maybe only Trudeau's do it. That's where my research on this stopped. But I found it fascinating that the last time that inflation was sort of the big issue, there was also a big, we're going to move the shelves around a lot and see if you're still paying attention. In that case, they did leave a few key ministers in place, including my dad, I will note. So there is a bit of similarity. And I don't know whether that anybody inside whether this echoed it on purpose or not.
Oh, what a fascinating analogy. In that election campaign that you referred to, Amanda, the slogan was "The land is strong," and of course that didn't quite connect with people and how they felt about their own circumstances. And there's something similar happening now too, right? The shuffles happened the same week as a pretty devastating Abacus poll that shows the Liberal Party is about 10 percentage points below the Conservatives, and a Globe and Mail editorial that documented various ways in which the government's economic record lags its predecessors. Assuming the Liberal NDP parliamentary agreement holds, we're less than 2 years from the next election. What can the government do policy-wise, Amanda, to reverse some of these trends?
It's an interesting question because, of course, as you know, as well as anybody, I think we can agree that how people are doing personally, fiscally, is one of the driving issues. So the economy is stupid, of course, is the kind of the old expression, and it's very true that when people feel as though their personal situation is deteriorating, they think that perhaps somebody else is to blame. And in this case, it may be slightly unfairly cast in the sense that there've been some massive global issues that have affected our economy, and it probably wouldn't have mattered much who is in charge. And P.S., when that pandemic came, whether you agree with what happened or not, this was a government that responded with massive support for citizens. And we will all recall that in the wake of that, sentiment about the government was very strong. People loved that the government was there for them. Now we're grappling with stuff That's a little bit harder for the government to counter. Globally bred inflation, an unemployment scene that's still strong, but of course we keep being warned, and sentiment is a lot more about the headlines than reality in some cases. We keep being warned that the labor market not only will get softer, but has to get softer. We have to see job losses or there won't be success on inflation. And so you could see why people would feel unsettled by that, even if their own situation is okay. And again, and things like my house was notionally worth 40% more 2 years ago than it is today. Even if it doesn't matter, even if I'm not going to sell it, I might be mad about that. So I do wonder whether, I guess I would turn the question back to you as somebody who's kind of been on the other side of this equation. When there's a limit to what the government can do, how do you message that? When it really is beyond your control, that's not really something you can say, right? Because you're supposed to be leading.
Yeah, that's right. There's also a challenge that few governments have been able to overcome, which is the challenge of appearing fresh and new and future-oriented after being in government for a long period of time. A government is, as I said on the Hub Roundtable podcast last Friday, all-consuming. It's transactional. It's a kind of day-to-day grind. And of course, that has been even more so the case for this government when you think about its trajectory. It starts with Donald Trump becoming the president. And then just as that seems to be stabilizing, we're hit by a once-in-a-century pandemic and now an inflation crisis. And of course, all of the other chinks in the armor that come about after being in office for so long. And so I think one of the challenges that it faces is simply finding a new way to breathe life into the government's agenda, introduce energy and so on. And I think that's in large part what yesterday's cabinet shuffle was all about. I would just say in parentheses, Amanda, I can't think of too many instances where Canadian governments, incumbent governments, have, when that perception starts to take shape within the Canadian public, have been able to overcome it. The two exceptions that I can think of in recent years are when Dalton McGuinty is replaced by Kathleen Wynne as the Ontario Liberal Party leader and is able to eke out one more election win. And in British Columbia, where similarly Christy Clark replaced Gordon Campbell and the BC Liberals won one more election before ultimately turning over the reins of power. The leader on the top of this government, of course, hasn't changed. And so this kind of underlying challenge of how does the government stay fresh, stay future oriented, I think is going to be one of the biggest challenges this government faces as we move towards the 2025 election campaign. And in that vein, I want to take up a particular issue, and that is the one of housing you mentioned earlier. There's been a lot of attention paid to the appointment of Sean Fraser to the housing file in light of growing agitation, particularly among younger Canadians, about housing prices. What do you make of Fraser's appointment? And what, if anything, do you think we might see in terms of new policy from the government on housing?
I mean, that's such an interesting question. I liked the, symmetry of the immigration minister being shuffled to housing because, of course, that is the hot potato one to the other, right? So immigration is the fuel of new problems. And we just got a new analysis this week from TD on this of just how much it will increase the shortage that we already have in housing. So yeah, you caused this problem. Now you get to solve it. I like that a lot, actually. I think people find him very credible, and I think that's a sign of seriousness on the file. Not that Huson was unserious or doing a bad job. I will say, I don't think that the federal government doesn't own this file. So the federal government can do a limited amount on it, and they've earmarked a lot of money to try to do things. But B, we have a problem in this country that goes beyond, of course, identifying the issue and then mobilizing to solve the issue. And the gap is too many players don't want the issue solved. Yes. I mean, if we need to be blunt about that, too many players in government and outside of government like the housing market exactly the way it is, which is to say, when there is limited supply of that quantity, the value stays high, and we are all beneficiaries of that. And by the way, I mean, we've talked about this, but the number of sitting MPs who are themselves owner of investment property housing is shockingly high. Should they not be? I'm not suggesting, that, but it is when we're talking about making policy. If we get housing right, the value of your home, my home, your neighbor's home should go down. It should go down. That's what affordability is. There's no other way to put it. And who's going to campaign on that? Exactly nobody. So it's a long way of saying until we actually become galvanized by there's enough people, a critical mass of people, of voters who don't have access to the housing they need, the rest of us are going to keep the financialization of housing exactly how it is, and it's in our favor.
Yeah. Great insight there. I saw on Fraser's shift from immigration to the housing file, I saw someone characterize it as moving from being the minister for housing demand to the minister of housing supply.
Exactly.
As you say, there's something of a symmetry there. He closed the door yesterday to any changes to immigration policy in the context of housing affordability, which, as you say, removes one of the clear levers the federal government has on the supply-demand equation. And so you're right. In the absence of that, the range of tools available to the government are somewhat limited. Mm-hmm. There's been some discussion about using federal transfers to provinces and municipalities as carrots or sticks to try to galvanize the type of land use reform that we need to make it easier to build. Mike Moffat, a University of Ottawa professor, had an interesting Globe and Mail op-ed this week about some other things the federal government might do to try to boost productivity in housing construction, including, but not limited to, building homes off-site as a means to try to increase productivity in a sector which is actually quite unproductive, even in the Canadian context, relative to some other parts of the economy. So there are, as you say, there are some steps the government can take, but the one that no federal politician seems prepared to talk about, and it relates to some of the points you made earlier about the economy of housing, is the capital gains exemption on primary residence. It is a significant federal outlay, Amanda. I haven't looked at the numbers in recent years, but we're talking billions of dollars. Yep. And there are academics and others who at different times make the case for some kind of reform to change the incentives around, as you say, the kind of growing financialization of housing. But there's no reason to think that that's on the table. And so instead, what we're likely to see is the kind of tinkering on the margins that you mentioned. In that vein, I want to go back, though, to something we were talking about earlier, which is the kind of challenge of longevity itself, and a growing sense that the government looks somewhat old and tired. And I should clarify that this is by no means a partisan observation. That the same perception grew around the Harper government as it approached the 2015 election. If you were advising the Trudeau government, what are some policy areas where they might make some big bets in terms of reinvigorating its agenda?
So I mean that I'm not going to stray into your arena because it's too far beyond my capability. I will acknowledge and agree with you that Canadian voters have a tendency to vote people out rather than voting people in, and so incumbency can work against you. And it's been a long run for the face of this government. Not all of these ministers, of course. What I would say is, if I were asked for advice and I clumsily gave it, you know what I long for, Sean, is a little bit more fortitude on the part of individual ministers and the government as a whole to actually give Canadians the credibility that we can understand hard things. And by that I mean, and I guess I'll just point to, and I don't have great expertise in this, I don't want to dig too deep into it, but with Lametti out at Justice, I must say my heart sank a little bit. And that's not to say the incoming minister doesn't look amazing. He does. His credentials look super sound. But was Lametti shuffled because there were a couple of hot button issues? And you could actually say the same of Mendocino, that may have highlighted internal processes problems, right? When ministers don't either hear about things or in a way that they are not able to absorb it, there's obviously a systems issue there that we should really look at. And that's important. I mean, anybody could stand up and say, wow, you should have known about that. And let's not point fingers about who was told what and when, either on public security or on an issue of justice. Let's be clear about that our systems are working. And we tend to do this kind of duck and cover and, soundbite response. I just wish we were more adult about these things and we could stand up and say, look, this happened. We own it. Here's how we're fixing it. Let's just understand, everybody, that this is what went down, instead of letting the kind of partisan drag you down and you dodge and weave and deny. I guess I just wish there's more maturity about all of the issues. You do get that from some ministers. I think we've had that from Chrystia Freeland on the issues and what the government's doing about them. So I would say just holding ground a little bit, I think, will gain you credibility with people that are just wondering what's really happening and who knows what's going on in Ottawa these days.
Yeah, I think that's right. This government came to office in 2015 with a pretty bold, ambitious agenda. It exuded energy and confidence and youthfulness, even. And that has come to dissipate a bit. And as I said earlier, that there's something natural to that is not unique to this government. But I think if it's going to have a chance in the next election, it's going to need to try to find a way to breathe that energy back into its agenda. Some different, you mentioned issues around accountability, transparency. I like the idea of a kind of adult conversation about the opportunities and challenges facing the country. I'm struck that we are approaching a major anniversary of the Macdonald Royal Commission from the mid-1980s, which really set Canada on a different path when it came to economic policy. But its importance wasn't just merely its policy recommendations, as important as they were, but it's that it set out a kind of bold and aspirational vision for the country's economy and society and its democracy. And it seems to me that's a piece of the puzzle that's missing right now. And I'm not proposing a royal commission between now and the next election, but sort of finding inspiration from the coming anniversary of the Macdonald Commission seems to me something that could start to put some coherence around the various disparate things that the government is doing. I was just on recording a podcast this week, Amanda, and when you think about it, the government has an audacious agenda around essentially bringing an end to the internal combustion engine, from supporting the production of electric vehicles to supporting the purchase of electric vehicles to the underlying minerals involved, the public infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. And yet it hasn't found a kind of charismatic way to connect the dots between these various policies and their importance for the country's economy and the environment. So I think, as you say, there's a lot to be done around just being straight with Canadians and direct, and not succumbing to the tendency towards talking points which are endemic in politics, but they seem to be even more common as a government gets a bit longer in the tooth. You mentioned earlier, Amanda, pandemic benefits, and I want to shift the conversation now, if that's okay, to new calls from the Chamber of Commerce to extend the repayment period, which is set to expire at the end of the year, on business loans provided under the Canadian Emergency Business Account Program during the pandemic. The program paid out $49 billion to roughly 900,000 businesses. Some of that money, as you know, was available in forgivable loans, but the rest is expected to be paid back. Presently, about 21% of businesses have fully repaid their loans. What do you make of the request for an extension? Is it a good idea or a bad idea? And do you think the government will ultimately do it?
So this actually there's a pretty good through line to a government that may have to deliver a hard message. And I hope they do on this one. I hope that this is one where we can be adult about this. And let me say that this is by no way to be unsympathetic to entrepreneurs, small business people that start businesses. It is without question, the lifeblood of this economy. And when we have productivity gains, that's where they lie, right? It's in people that start something out of nothing and they grow things. The argument from the Chamber of Commerce is that 1 in 5 of the businesses with these loans will go under if they don't get yet another extension. There's already been an extension, by the way. And let me just hit pause for one quick second and note that these loans are, yes, if repaid by the end of this year, a big chunk of them is fully forgivable. And the other chunk is interest-free. So this is kind of like a, never never land sort of loan. After December, the forgivable part goes away. Your interest rate is I think it's 5%. It just turns into a regular, pretty good loan on today's rates. So it's not as though anything terrible happens. It's just reality, a pretty nice reality comes back. So let's just jump back to this 1 in 5 won't survive. If I told you to guess how many businesses a year go out of business in Canada, I don't know what number you would land at if I threw that at you, but I'll save you from trying to guess, Sean, and tell you it's 1 in 5. 20% of businesses go out of business every year. And by the way, 50% go out of business in 5 years and 70% don't make it to 10 years.
Wow.
So that there is business rollover isn't just a sad reality for the folks involved. It is, again, not diminishing that part. But I will say, for a healthy functioning economy, it is how the organism works. They grow. Some shoots are green and live and grow, and other ones die off. And that's important, because the ones that die off aren't supposed to be businesses for whatever reason. There's a variety of reasons. So what we saw through pandemic was, of course, a huge drop in insolvencies, personal and corporate, because people were protected from the natural forces of the economy. Well, we need to bring them back. And that's not, again, to diminish the fact that for some businesses, we're not back to normal. We have seen, of course, lags in returns to revenue streams, just sheer markets for things in certain spaces like hospitality. That's a reality. Restaurants aren't back to where they were in 2019. But you got to adapt. How long do we say yesterday will be tomorrow? It's, tomorrow's different. It always was going to be. And so it's a hard line I take. I hope the government is as straightforward with Canadians as they need to be. And they say, look, we get it. It's hard, but this is what's going to happen.
Yeah. A brilliant analysis, Amanda. I wasn't familiar with some of those data points. That's really compelling. And as you say, it's a adult message, but the idea of creative destruction has a creative part and a destructive part, and they work together. And if they don't, if public policy in effect breaks the relationship between creation and destruction, it can produce distortions throughout the economy. And the case for government stepping in and backstopping businesses during the pandemic made a great deal of sense, because of course the pressures they were facing weren't the functioning of the market. They were the result of government policy. But at some point, as you say, we need to get back to letting markets do what markets do, which is to reward good ideas and to punish bad ones, or maybe badly executed ones, maybe a better way to put it. And in that sense, I
Which,
think,
by the way, often frees up those entrepreneurs to go on and do the thing that will be a hit. When we should also, side note, Canada is full of what we call zombie businesses. And here I'm not talking about startups, mom and pop shops. We're talking about big companies. And we've probably seen the data that you can slice and dice this, and some sectors of our economy sort of skew the data a little bit. But regardless of how you look at it, we have way too many companies that survive past their best buy date. Like we just shouldn't. And now, is there government policy that could solve that? Maybe. I don't know what that would look like. But if I were inside finance, I'd be looking at that. To how do you make sure we don't have 500 employee companies that shouldn't be in existence, because that's also, of course, affecting our whole economy, our productivity, our innovation rates, and of course, the new jobs that we all are going to require in the future.
Yeah, particularly in a world of tight labor markets, we need to be eking out as much productivity of our workers as possible. And that means moving at different times from low performing firms to high-performing ones. But let's wrap up with a bit of speculation about whether the government will take your adult advice. We started this conversation in a context of pretty poor polling for the government, economic data, which similarly casts some negative light on the government's performance. Do you think it's in a position to kind of hold the line on these demands?
You know, I wish I could say because the government's been silent and because it's already extended once. I wish I could say that's evidence that they will hold the line on this. But to your point, there are so many things that suggest they'll cave. And one of them, of course, is that money is funny money everywhere these days. The government writes checks without kind of worrying too much, and the dollars involved here just aren't big in the context of where we sit in terms of our spending and our deficits. So it would be an easy. Gosh, I hope they don't. Is what I would say. But if I really had if something important was riding on this and I had to bet, I'd say yes, they'll extend.
Well, we'll keep following this story. I want to thank you for joining me, Amanda, and look forward to catching up in a couple of weeks.
Great to talk.